Russell Brand walked into the studio knowing exactly what was about to happen. He had been invited under the pretense of a fair discussion, but he wasn't naive. This was an ambush. The host, Alex Grant, had built a career on dismantling guests who challenged the mainstream narrative. He had the audience, the production team, the carefully crafted questions, all designed to put Brand on the defensive, to expose him as a conspiracy theorist, a provocateur. But what no one in that room realized was that the script had already failed. The cameras were rolling, the stage was set, but the man they had brought here to be taken down wasn't playing by their rules. And as the interview unfolded, it became clear that for the first time in his career, Alex Grant was losing control. What began as an attempt to corner Russell Brand would soon become something else entirely, a moment that exposed the very system it was meant to protect. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The air in the studio was thick with tension. The host, a polished man in his 40s with the kind of artificial charisma that television breeds, sat rigid in his chair, his carefully rehearsed confidence now slipping. Across from him, Russell Brand leaned back, a slight smirk playing on his lips, fingers laced together in his lap. The audience was unusually quiet. They had come expecting a spectacle, a dismantling, a lesson in how to take down a so-called conspiracy theorist on live television. But something had shifted. The energy was no longer in the host's favor. The cameras were still rolling, the lights still blinding, but the power in the room had subtly changed hands. The host cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, gripping the stack of cue cards in front of him a little too tightly. He was known for being sharp, relentless, a man who could eviscerate a guest with a carefully placed question and a well-timed smirk. But now there was no smirk, just a thin line of tension at the corners of his mouth. His eyes darting for support from the production team behind the cameras. They couldn't help him now, this was live. Russell tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him, like a cat watching a cornered mouse. The moment lingered, stretching just long enough for the discomfort to settle into the bones of everyone watching. And then he spoke. "So, tell me," he said, his voice soft, almost curious. "At what point did you realize this wasn't going the way you planned?" A flicker of irritation crossed the host's face, quickly masked with a forced chuckle. "Russell, come on, let's be serious." "Oh, I am." Brand cut in smoothly, his smile widening. "You see, what's fascinating is that you came into this interview with an agenda. You wanted to put me in a box, slap a label on me, make me fit a narrative that suits your network. But now, you're realizing something quite unfortunate, aren't you? The box doesn't fit, the label doesn't stick, and the narrative, well, the narrative is slipping right through your fingers." The audience, sensing the shift, murmured. A few people laughed, not because Brand had told a joke, but because the entire dynamic had changed in a matter of seconds. The host opened his mouth, then closed it, recalibrating. This was supposed to be easy. He was supposed to lead. He was supposed to control the flow, guide the conversation, put Russell on the defensive. But now, he was the one defending. And the worst part? The cameras were still on, capturing every second of it. Brand leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto the host's. "Shall we continue, or would you like a moment to collect yourself?" The studio was designed for control. Everything from the carefully positioned cameras to the calibrated lighting served a purpose: to shape perception, to frame narratives, to ensure that no guest, no matter how outspoken, could ever truly dictate the flow of conversation. The walls were a muted shade of blue, the kind of color that projected authority without intimidation. The audience, though present, was carefully selected. People who would react on cue, who would laugh when prompted, who would provide the illusion of organic engagement while following the unspoken rules of television. It was all a machine, finely tuned, predictable. Until tonight. Russell Brand sat in the guest chair, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He had been in countless studios like this before, faced countless interviewers who believed themselves to be intellectual titans, wielding questions like weapons, expecting their guests to fold under pressure. But he knew the game. He understood how the illusion was built, how the strings were pulled. And most importantly, he understood something that the host, sitting stiffly across from him, was just beginning to realize. None of those tactics worked on someone who refused to play by their rules. The host, Alex Grant, was a veteran of the industry. His job wasn't to inform, but to frame, to craft a digestible story for his audience. He was the kind of man who prided himself on his ability to corner guests, to make them fluster, to reduce them to sound bites that could be repackaged and fed to the masses. He thrived in controlled environments, where his questions were sharp and his guests were unprepared. But tonight, something was different. From the moment Russell had walked onto the set, there had been an energy shift, an intangible, almost imperceptible change in the air. It was in the way the crew exchanged glances, in the slight hesitation before Alex spoke, in the way Russell's presence seemed to absorb all the space in the room without him having to say a word. The opening pleasantries had been exchanged, the kind that meant nothing. Forced smiles, the obligatory thank you for being here, the light chuckles that masked the undercurrent of what was to come. But as soon as the cameras had rolled and the real interview had begun, Alex had moved in for the attack, wasting no time in establishing his angle. The narrative was clear from the outset. Russell Brand, once a comedian, now a self-styled political commentator, had veered too far into dangerous territory. He had spoken too freely about corporate media, about government narratives, about the manufactured nature of consensus. And now he was here, being placed under the microscope, expected to justify himself, to defend against accusations that had already been carefully crafted before he had even entered the building. Alex leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his tone measured but edged with something sharper. Russell, you've built quite a following in recent years, moving from comedy into political commentary. But with that shift has come criticism. People say you've drifted into conspiracy theories, into misinformation. What do you say to those who believe you've abandoned credibility for sensationalism? It was the kind of question that was designed not to be answered, but to frame the conversation, to plant an idea in the audience's mind before Brand could even respond. The accusation was embedded within it, subtle but unmistakable. It was not a question so much as an assertion masked as one. Russell smiled, tilting his head slightly as if weighing his words, but there was something behind his eyes. Something that suggested he had already mapped out the course of this conversation long before it had even begun. "It's an interesting thing, isn't it?" he mused, his voice carrying an almost amused curiosity, the way words like conspiracy get thrown around. It's a convenient little term, isn't it? A way to dismiss anything that challenges the accepted narrative. Tell me, Alex, how many times in history has something been labeled a conspiracy theory, only for it to later be proven true? There was a shift in the room, a subtle one, but there nonetheless. Alex's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, the briefest moment of recalibration. He had expected deflection, perhaps even defensiveness. He had not expected Russell to go on the offensive so soon. Alex chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, Russell, let's be serious. You know as well as I do that spreading doubt and questioning institutions is a dangerous game. We have journalistic integrity to maintain. Facts matter." Russell leaned in slightly, mirroring the host's posture, his smile widening just a fraction. "Yes, Alex, facts do matter, which is precisely why we should be having conversations, not shutting them down before they even begin. Don't you think?" The audience stirred. A few heads turned. A small reaction, but enough to suggest that some of them were already beginning to question who was truly in control of this conversation. Alex glanced at the camera for a split second, a flicker of awareness that everything was being captured, that he had to maintain composure, that he could not afford to lose ground. He straightened his shoulders, pressing forward, trying to reassert dominance. "Well, let's talk about facts, then," he said, flipping through his cue cards, searching for the next angle. "Because there's plenty to go over." And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. Alex adjusted the stack of cue cards in front of him, his fingers pressing into the edges as if searching for something solid to grip. The illusion of control had to be maintained. He had played this game too many times to let it slip this early. The audience, though quiet, was watching closely, and he could feel the weight of the cameras, the unseen millions who would later dissect every word, every glance, every shift in body language. This was his arena. He was going to be bested in his own house. He exhaled through his nose, offering a small, knowing smile. All right, Russell, let's talk specifics. Since you're such a champion of questioning authority, let's examine some of your claims. You've repeatedly suggested that mainstream media is in the pocket of corporate interests, that journalists are not independent thinkers, but rather puppets of the system. It's a bold accusation. Do you truly believe that news organizations, staffed by thousands of trained professionals, are collectively involved in some grand deception? Russell let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. He did not rush, did not fidget. Instead, he regarded Alex with that same measured amusement, like a man watching someone attempt a card trick he had already figured out. "It's fascinating, isn't it?" he mused, tilting his head. "The way you phrase that, grand deception. It's a clever little trick, really. Makes it sound like I believe in some shadowy cabal of journalists meeting in secret lairs, plotting how to manipulate the public. But I don't need to believe in a secret conspiracy, Alex. I just need to look at the structure of power. Who funds your network? Who owns the newspapers? Whose interests are being served by the stories you choose to tell?" He gestured lightly toward the cameras, toward the unseen decision-makers who sat in corporate offices, far from the glaring lights of the studio. "That's not a conspiracy. That's just business." A murmur rippled through the audience, small but noticeable. Alex's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had been expecting evasion, maybe even defensiveness. What he was getting instead was something far more dangerous. Russell was reframing the conversation in real time, shifting it from abstract theory to cold, undeniable structure. This was not the babbling of an unhinged commentator. This was precision, and it was landing. Alex forced a chuckle, shaking his head as he glanced down at his notes. "So let me get this straight," he said, lifting his gaze again, his voice taking on a performative patience. "You're saying that every journalist working in these organizations is compromised? That they're all corrupt, all knowingly misleading the public? Because that's quite an accusation, Russell. I imagine there are a lot of hard-working reporters who would take issue with that." Russell's smile widened just a fraction. "Ah, there it is, the appeal to emotion, hard-working journalists, as if this is about individual integrity rather than systemic incentives. Of course, there are good journalists, brilliant ones, in fact. But here's the question, Alex. What happens to a journalist who steps too far outside the acceptable narrative? Do they get promoted? Do they get bigger platforms? Or do they find themselves pushed to the fringes, discredited, their careers mysteriously stalling? And if that's the case, is it really about individual corruption? Or is it about a system that rewards compliance and punishes dissent?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, stretching just long enough for the weight of the question to settle. Alex's expression remained carefully neutral, but his fingers tapped once against the desk, an unconscious tell. The audience was no longer simply watching a conversation. They were witnessing a shift, a subtle but unmistakable reversal of roles. Alex cleared his throat. "Look, I think we both know that journalism is an imperfect field, like any profession. But let's talk about the other side of this. You've positioned yourself as an alternative voice, someone who tells the truth the mainstream media won't. But that comes with its own responsibility, doesn't it? Your platform has reach, and when you share information that turns out to be false or misleading, doesn't that make you just as guilty of manipulation as the outlets you criticize?" Russell chuckled softly, running a hand through his beard as he leaned back slightly. "Ah, now we're getting somewhere, the old false equivalence move. See, Alex, you're attempting to conflate institutional power with independent critique. When a corporate media outlet spreads misinformation, let's say about weapons of mass destruction or pharmaceutical safety or economic policy, the consequences are global. Governments go to war, markets collapse, people lose everything. When an independent journalist gets something wrong, what happens? A tweet gets deleted? A retraction is issued. You're pretending these two things are equal when they're not even in the same stratosphere. Alex pressed his lips together, the flicker of frustration just barely visible. So, you're saying you're above accountability? Not at all, Russell said smoothly. I welcome accountability. I just don't pretend that holding a comedian to the same standard as billion-dollar media conglomerates is anything but absurd. But that's the trick, isn't it? Distract the audience, make it about me, make it about my supposed failings, my credibility, my mistakes. Anything to avoid the much larger question, why are the people meant to inform the public so afraid of real scrutiny? The tension in the room thickened. Alex shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his cufflink in a practiced motion. He was searching for his next move, but Russell was already 3 steps ahead. The audience, though quiet, had begun to lean in. They weren't just watching an interview anymore. They were watching a game unravel. Alex inhaled sharply, masking it with a measured nod as he reached for his next card. His confidence, though rattled, was still intact. He was not new to difficult interviews. He had weathered his fair share of combative guests, figures who mistook noise for substance, who could be baited into overplaying their hand. That was the strategy now. Push Russell just enough, nudge him off balance, make him emotional, because as long as he remained calm, in control, turning the questions back on their source, Alex was losing. He glanced at the audience. They were no longer watching passively. Some of them were leaning forward, others exchanging subtle glances, as if realizing they were seeing something they weren't supposed to see. This wasn't an easy takedown. This wasn't a fringe commentator getting schooled by the establishment. If anything, it felt like the establishment was the one struggling to keep its grip. Alex pressed forward, voice tightening just enough to suggest a shift in approach. You make an interesting point, Russell, but let's talk about something very real: misinformation. You say you welcome accountability, but you've made claims that simply don't hold up under scrutiny. Let's take an example. You've repeatedly suggested that pharmaceutical companies have financial incentives to mislead the public. That's a dangerous assertion. Millions of people rely on these medications, these treatments. When you spread doubt, don't you risk harming them? Isn't there a point where skepticism becomes recklessness? Russell's eyes gleamed with something almost like amusement. Ah, there it is, the moralizing. He clasped his hands together, tilting his head slightly, like a professor indulging an overeager student. It's always fascinating to me when people in your position talk about the dangers of misinformation as if it's some unique disease afflicting independent voices. You sit there representing a network that has spent decades amplifying falsehoods, whether about wars, financial crises, or the very pharmaceutical industry you're now so valiantly defending. And yet, suddenly, when someone outside your institution dares to ask questions, the concern for truth and public safety becomes overwhelming. Alex shifted in his chair. His grip on the cue cards tightened, his jaw tensed. Russell wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't ranting, but every word he spoke felt like a blade sliding precisely into place, cutting away the polished veneer of authority that the show depended on. Russell continued, voice steady. You want to talk about consequences? Let's do that. What were the consequences when networks like yours pushed the idea of weapons of mass destruction? When financial analysts, given airtime by corporate news, dismissed concerns about market stability right before the crash of 2008, when pharmaceutical companies were protected from scrutiny despite knowingly distributing products later recalled for causing harm. Where was this righteous indignation about the dangers of misinformation then? A murmur rippled through the audience, this one louder than before. Alex caught it, his expression tightening. He needed to regain control. Fast. Russell, you're deflecting. None of that absolves you of responsibility. You have a platform, you have influence, and when you suggest that institutions can't be trusted, you create a vacuum. You open the door to conspiracy theories, to fear, to people rejecting medicine, rejecting science. Doesn't that bother you? Russell let out a small chuckle, shaking his head slightly. You're trying to frame this as a false choice, as if the only options are blind trust or chaos. But that's not how an informed society works, Alex. The role of journalism, true journalism, isn't to manufacture trust, it's to earn it. Yet here you are, scolding people for daring to question, framing dissent as danger, and that's precisely the problem. Alex exhaled sharply, visibly irritated now. This isn't about dissent, this is about facts, and the fact is, when people with large audiences spread misinformation, they create real harm. Russell's smile faded, and for the first time there was something sharper in his tone. And when institutions spread misinformation at a scale you can't even measure, what happens then? You want to talk about harm? Let's talk about the policies justified by lies, the wars fought over false premises, the financial collapses that ruined millions of lives. Where was this energy then, Alex? Where was this deep concern about misinformation when it was coming from the mouths of government officials and media executives instead of independent voices? The studio was dead silent now. Alex had no immediate response. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Russell watched him, waiting, his expression unreadable. The audience had shifted. No longer passive spectators, they were participants in the tension, their silence speaking louder than applause ever could. The cameras were still rolling, the world was still watching, and Alex Grant, for the first time in his career, looked as if he had no idea what to say next. Alex shifted in his chair, buying himself a few seconds, but the silence was suffocating. The carefully maintained structure of the interview had crumbled, and now he was stranded in unfamiliar territory. This was not how it was supposed to go. By now, the guest should have been on the defensive, scrambling to justify himself under the weight of well-researched counterpoints. Instead, Russell sat there, calm, composed, watching him with the patience of a man who already knew exactly where this was going. The audience wasn't just observing anymore, they were waiting for something, sensing that the balance of power had fully tipped. Alex straightened, forced a small, almost dismissive laugh, and reached for one last card. All right, Russell, let's stop pretending this is just an intellectual debate. You love to play the role of the independent thinker, the fearless truth teller, but let's be honest. This is a brand for you, isn't it? You've built a career out of stirring controversy, making people doubt institutions, feeding into paranoia. It's profitable, isn't it? You claim to be outside the system, yet here you are, sitting in this chair, reaching millions, benefiting from the very structures you pretend to criticize. So tell me, how is that any different from the so-called corrupt media you claim to expose? The question was sharp, well-practiced, the kind designed to force the guest into a corner, to expose hypocrisy, to plant the seed of doubt. If Russell hesitated, if he fumbled even slightly, that was the opening Alex needed. A weakness, a contradiction, the kind that could be clipped, shared, replayed endlessly to restore the narrative that had been slipping from his grasp. But Russell didn't hesitate. He didn't fumble. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and for the first time in the interview, his expression shifted, not to amusement, not to detachment, but to something colder, something calculated. "That's a great question, Alex," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Let's talk about profit. Let's talk about who really benefits from the way this industry operates." He gestured vaguely toward the studio, toward the cameras, toward the unseen executives behind the scenes. "You sit here on a network owned by a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, funded by advertising dollars from industries with direct stakes in the narratives you push. Pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, financial institutions. Your paycheck depends on towing a certain line, on ensuring that the people watching this at home never think too hard about where their information comes from or whose interests it serves. And yet, you have the audacity to sit there and question whether I, an independent creator, am the real profiteer?" He let the words hang for just a second before delivering the next blow. "Tell me, Alex, when was the last time you were allowed to criticize the people who actually sign your checks?" The air in the room changed. Alex blinked, just once, but in that second something flickered in his expression, an instinctual reaction he couldn't suppress. Russell had seen it before, the telltale crack in the facade of a man who knew deep down that he had been exposed. It was small, almost imperceptible, but the audience caught it. They saw the hesitation, the flicker of discomfort, and suddenly, the power dynamic of the conversation was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. Russell didn't stop. "You accuse me of playing a role, of being a brand. But what are you, Alex? A journalist? An interviewer? Or just an actor in a script written by people who don't even have to be in the room to control what you can and cannot say? He leaned back slightly, tilting his head. If I say something that offends one of your sponsors, what happens? Do you get a call? Does your producer step in? Do you find out in a week that your segment has been restructured? Or maybe it's more subtle than that. Maybe it's just understood certain lines don't get crossed, certain stories don't get pursued. You don't even have to be told anymore, you just know. The silence stretched. It was different from before. Not just tense, not just uncomfortable, but something heavier, a realization settling into the bones of the people watching. Alex wasn't in control anymore. The audience knew it. He knew it. The audience genuinely knew it. Alex exhaled through his nose, forcing another chuckle, but it sounded thinner this time. That's a nice conspiracy theory, Russell. But let's be real. This network covers all kinds of perspectives. We have dissenting voices on all the time. Russell's expression didn't change. Dissenting voices that never actually challenge the system that funds you. Alex opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Russell had anticipated every move, blocked every exit, left no room for escape. Russell smiled, but it wasn't a smile of amusement anymore. It was the smile of a man who knew he had won. The real difference between you and me, Alex? He gestured between them. You need permission to say what you say. I don't. The room was silent. The audience, the crew, even the unseen executives in their control rooms. No one spoke. For the first time, Alex Grant, the man who had built his career on controlling conversations, looked like a man with nothing left to say. The silence in the studio was no longer just awkward. It was suffocating. Alex Grant, a man who had built his reputation on cutting down guests with carefully crafted narratives, was now sitting there, visibly unraveling. His fingers toyed with the edges of his cue cards, but he didn't look at them. His eyes flickered toward the camera, then toward the producer sitting just beyond the lights. But no one could save him now. The illusion had been shattered. The audience knew it, the crew knew it, and worst of all, he knew it. Russell remained exactly as he had been the entire time, calm, relaxed, as if none of this had cost him even the slightest bit of effort. He studied Alex for a moment, then exhaled softly, shaking his head. See, this is what happens when you mistake control for truth. You thought if you controlled the framing, the flow of conversation, the way the questions were asked, you could control the outcome. But that only works if the person sitting across from you accepts the terms of engagement. He leaned forward slightly. I don't. Alex swallowed, his throat visibly tightening. You're twisting this into some grand conspiracy. No, I'm not. Russell cut in smoothly. That's your trick, isn't it? The moment the conversation gets too close to reality, you dismiss it as conspiracy. Because that word, conspiracy, it shuts people down, it makes them hesitate, it makes them second guess. But here's the thing, Alex. People aren't hesitating anymore. They're watching this right now, and they see exactly what's happening. They see you dodging, they see you clinging to your script, desperately hoping it will still work, but it won't. Not anymore. A ripple went through the audience. Something unspoken, a shift in awareness, a realization that they had been waiting for. This wasn't just an interview anymore, it was something else entirely. A reckoning. Alex's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk as he tried to salvage what little authority he had left. Russell, you can posture all you want, but at the end of the day, you're still benefiting from the same media ecosystem you claim to oppose. You're here on television using this platform just like everyone else. Russell let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. No, Alex, I'm not using this platform, I'm exposing it. He gestured toward the cameras, the lights, the invisible machinery of the show itself. I don't need this, you do. Because without this set, without this controlled environment, without the carefully curated optics that make you appear authoritative, what are you? Just another man sitting at a desk, afraid of losing control. The words hit like a hammer. The audience, which had remained mostly silent throughout, finally broke. a wave of murmurs rolling through them, some people nodding, others exchanging glances. Even those who had entered this room fully expecting to see Russell Brand dismantled were now questioning what they had just witnessed. The grip Alex had maintained over them, over the narrative, was gone. Alex sat there, his mouth opening as if he had anything to say, but no words came. He had lost, and worse than losing, he had lost in front of a live audience, on a show designed to reinforce his power. The cameras were still rolling. Millions of people would see this. There was no edit that could fix what had just happened. Russell sat back in his chair, exuding nothing but ease. "Shall we wrap this up?" he asked, his tone light, as if this had been nothing more than a casual conversation between old friends. Alex hesitated, then finally, with visible reluctance, glanced toward the control booth. A pause. A silent signal. A producer somewhere off-screen gave the nod. A small red light above the camera flickered, and the screen cut to black. The show had ended, but the real conversation was just beginning. The broadcast had barely ended when the internet exploded. Within minutes, clips of the interview flooded social media, each one highlighting a different moment. Alex Grant's visible frustration, Russell Brand's effortless dismantling of the host's arguments, the moment of complete silence when Grant had nothing left to say. The hashtag Russell exposed. The media shot to the top of Twitter trends, while Reddit threads dissected the conversation in real time. Memes surfaced almost instantly, one in particular gaining traction. A screenshot of Brand leaning back with a smirk captioned, "Tell me, Alex, when was the last time you were allowed to criticize your bosses?" News outlets scrambled to control the narrative. Some networks ignored the interview entirely, hoping it would fade. Others attempted damage control, framing Brand's performance as aggressive and misleading. But it was too late. The raw footage was everywhere, unedited, beyond spin. Independent commentators on YouTube and Rumble uploaded breakdowns, analyzing every exchange, replaying the exact moment Alex lost control. Some called it the most devastating interview takedown in years. Others declared it the moment corporate media exposed itself on live television. By the next morning, mainstream journalists were issuing defensive tweets, accusing Brand's supporters of engaging in coordinated harassment, an accusation that only fueled the fire. The official YouTube upload of the interview had its comment section flooded with viewers mocking the host, praising Brand's composure and demanding answers. Even those who weren't fans of Brand admitted the obvious: he had walked into their domain, played by their rules, and still dominated. Meanwhile, Russell Brand remained silent. No victory posts, no statements, no self-congratulations. He didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. He had done what so many before him had failed to do. He had exposed the machinery of media in real time, on their own stage with their own cameras capturing every second of it. And the world had seen it happen.